My neighbor thought he could ruin me with the HOA, but what he didn't realize was that I had the perfect weapon, my drone. And that drone captured the very thing that would lead to his downfall. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I never thought of myself as someone who would end up in a neighborhood war. I've always been the type to keep to myself, tend to my garden, walk my dog in the evenings, and wave politely to the people I pass. I like things peaceful, orderly, and calm. That's why moving into a neighborhood with a homeowners association seemed like a safe bet. I figured the rules were there to keep everything fair and equal, to prevent anyone from turning their front yard into a junkyard or throwing wild parties. That went on until dawn. But I was wrong. It turns out, rules can be twisted. They can be weaponized. And when a person with too much pride and too little compassion gets their hands on those rules, they can turn them into a cudgel to beat down anyone they don't like. That person, in my story, was my neighbor. He wasn't just any neighbor, he was the kind who kept his nose in everyone else's business. The kind who made you nervous to even water your plants a little past curfew, because you knew he might be watching. He prided himself on being the eyes of the HOA. And for a while, I brushed it off. I thought, well, if that's how he finds purpose, good for him. But then came the day I opened my mailbox and found the first letter. It was from the HOA, warning me about a supposed violation. My trash can had been visible from the street for longer than the allotted 24 hours after pickup. I remember standing there on my porch, letter trembling slightly in my hands, staring at the line that said I'd be fined if it happened again. A mix of disbelief and embarrassment washed over me. I'd never been warned before. I kept a tidy house, a neat yard, and I followed the rules. I felt as if someone had shined a spotlight on me for all the wrong reasons. And deep down, I already knew who had made that report. It was my neighbor. He had been waiting for me to slip, and he pounced at the first opportunity. What stung even more wasn't the violation itself, it was how petty it all was. Something so small, so human, had been turned into ammunition against me. I realized, in that moment, that this wasn't just about a trash can. This was the beginning of something much larger. Because once someone like him knows they can get under your skin, they don't stop. They push harder, they dig deeper, and they find new ways to remind you that they have power. And I had no idea just how far he was willing to go. At the time all of this began, I was in my mid-30s, settled, and finally feeling like I had carved out a place I could truly call home. My little 2-story house wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. The yard was my pride, rows of flowers that bloomed in the spring, a vegetable patch tucked in the back, and a sturdy oak tree that gave shade on hot summer days. I liked the sense of stability it brought me. After years of moving from apartment to apartment, always worrying about noisy upstairs neighbors or landlords raising the rent, this place was a sanctuary. I was never one to stir up trouble. My approach to life was simple: respect others, mind your own business, and trust that people will treat you with the same courtesy. That belief had rarely let me down until I met him. My neighbor lived directly next door. From the outside, his property looked picture perfect. Manicured hedges, a driveway lined with expensive cars, and a house that always seemed to be getting some kind of upgrade. But underneath that polished surface was a man who thrived on control. He wasn't friendly in the neighborly sense. He wasn't the type to bring over cookies at Christmas or wave when you passed by. His smiles were tight, rehearsed, and almost always followed by some sharp comment disguised as advice. You know the type, someone who makes you feel like you're constantly being evaluated, judged, and found lacking. For instance, when I first moved in, he walked over one afternoon, hands in his pockets, and casually said, "I hope you plan to keep that oak tree trimmed." Branches like that can really ruin the look of the street. It wasn't phrased as a suggestion. It was a warning. I remember forcing a polite smile and telling him I'd take care of it, even though the tree was perfectly fine. That was my first hint of who he was. Over time, I saw the pattern more clearly. He was quick to report the smallest deviations from HOA rules, someone leaving holiday decorations up too long, a family that had too many guests parking on the street, a teenager's basketball hoop left by the curb. And he loved it. He basked in the discomfort of others when the HOA sent its little warning letters. It gave him an air of authority he couldn't seem to get anywhere else in his life. Looking back, I think he thrived on it because, in truth, he was an insecure man. His wealth, his perfectly staged home, even his sharp tone, they were all armor. And like many people who rely on appearances, he believed he was untouchable. Before the trouble started, I mostly kept my head down and avoided confrontation. I reminded myself, this is just how some people are. Let him play his games. As long as I follow the rules, he can't touch me. But I underestimated just how far he was willing to go to prove a point. I thought my normal world was stable, that my quiet life couldn't be shaken by someone else's pettiness. I was wrong, because soon, his obsession with the rules would crash headlong into his own hypocrisy, and I would be right in the middle of it. It happened on a warm Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the sun lingers in the sky and everything feels deceptively calm. I had just gotten home from work, still carrying my bag on one shoulder, when I noticed another envelope sitting in my mailbox. The HOAS logo was printed neatly in the corner, and my stomach sank before I even opened it. Inside was yet another warning. This time, the accusation was that I had left my grass to grow above the acceptable height. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. I had mowed just 3 days earlier, carefully trimming the edges and even sweeping the walkway afterward. My lawn was tidy, green, and in perfect compliance. Anyone with eyes could see that. I stood there in my driveway, reading the letter twice over, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was personal. I knew exactly who had made the complaint. It was him. And as if the universe wanted to confirm it, I glanced up and saw him standing on his porch, arms crossed, watching me. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He just stared, smug and unbothered, as though he were daring me to say something. That moment lit a fuse in me. Until then, I'd brushed off his passive-aggressive comments and tolerated his nitpicking reports. But now, it was different. He wasn't just being a nuisance, he was deliberately targeting me. He wanted me rattled, embarrassed, maybe even fined. I carried the letter inside and sat at my kitchen table, laying it down as though it were evidence in a trial. My dog padded over and sat at my feet, as if sensing my frustration. I ran my hand over her head absent-mindedly while my thoughts spiraled. Why me? Why now? What did he stand to gain from this? And then the answer came, sharp and simple. Power. He enjoyed the feeling of control. He liked seeing people bend under the weight of rules he didn't create but used as a weapon. I thought back to the first warning letter, about the trash can, and now this one about the lawn. They were so minor, so petty, but the effect was real. Each one left a blemish on my record with the HOA. Enough of those, and the fines would stack up. My reputation in the neighborhood would suffer. That was his plan. He wanted to chip away at me, bit by bit, until I either submitted to his scrutiny or gave up entirely. But I wasn't built to surrender. That letter was the moment I realized I had to do something. I couldn't keep living under his shadow, wondering when the next envelope would show up or what baseless accusation he'd throw my way. The line had been crossed, and though I didn't know it yet, the battle that began with a trash can and a blade of grass was about to escalate into something much bigger, something that would eventually bring down the very man who tried to break me. After that second letter, I told myself I would be meticulous. If my neighbor wanted to nitpick, I would give him nothing to latch onto. I set reminders on my phone to wheel the trash bins back within the hour after pickup. I trimmed my grass twice as often, even when it didn't need it. I kept my hedges perfectly level and my walkway clear. But it didn't matter, because this was never about the rules themselves. It was about him finding new ways to remind me that he was in control. The next letter arrived just 2 weeks later. This time, the complaint was that my car had been parked in my own driveway for an extended period of time, which supposedly made the street look cluttered. I remember reading that and feeling an almost surreal kind of disbelief. It was my driveway, my property. How could anyone object to that? Yet the whole letter was clear. The complaint had been filed, and if the matter wasn't resolved, fines would follow. I started keeping a mental list of the ridiculous accusations. A garden ornament that was too distracting. A holiday wreath that I'd left hanging for 3 days past the official season. Even the sound of my dog barking when the mailman arrived earned me a notice. Each time I received a letter, I felt the same mix of humiliation and fury, as though I were being called into the principal's office for something I hadn't done. And every time, I would catch sight of him, my neighbor, hovering nearby. He always seemed to be around when I found a new letter. Watching, waiting. He thrived on the sight of me opening my mailbox and frowning at whatever petty accusation he'd managed to cook up. It became obvious that he wasn't just reporting me randomly, he was targeting me with intention. Out of all the houses on our street, mine had suddenly become the one under constant scrutiny. Meanwhile, his yard projects and late-night parties went unnoticed, or so it seemed. What really gnawed at me was the arrogance behind it. He walked around the neighborhood as if he were the unofficial sheriff, patrolling for infractions. I overheard him more than once bragging to other neighbors about how he kept the street in line. He made it sound like a badge of honor, as though he were doing a public service by dragging his neighbors through endless HOA bureaucracy. The tension began to bleed into my everyday life. I found myself looking over my shoulder every time I stepped outside. I hesitated before putting out lawn furniture or hanging wind chimes, wondering if he'd find some obscure rule to twist into another report. I hated the way it made me feel small, boxed in, as though I were a guest in my own home. But the breaking point hadn't come yet. Not quite. Because what I didn't know at the time was that while he was so busy pointing fingers at me, he was hiding a secret of his own. One far bigger than a trash can, a car, or a lawn. And when I discovered it, everything would change. Asterisk, the straw that broke the camel's back came on an otherwise ordinary Saturday morning. I had just finished weeding the flower beds out front, enjoying the quiet hum of bees and the smell of fresh soil, when I heard the distinct rumble of heavy machinery coming from somewhere nearby. It wasn't the usual lawnmower or hedge trimmer. This was deeper, louder, more industrial, curious. I set down my gloves and followed the sound around the side of my house. That's when I noticed the tall wooden privacy panels that had gone up in my neighbor's backyard. They hadn't been there before. At first, I thought maybe he was repairing his fence or adding some landscaping. But as I stood there listening, The unmistakable clatter of hammers and drills cut through the air. Something big was happening on the other side of that fence. Later that day, while I was bringing groceries inside, I caught a glimpse through a narrow gap between the boards. What I saw nearly made me laugh out loud from the sheer hypocrisy of it. There, right in the middle of his backyard, was the deep rectangular pit of a brand new pool under construction. Workers were bustling around, pouring concrete, adjusting rebar, and hauling in supplies. It wasn't just a little above-ground setup, it was a full-scale, in-ground pool now. Here's the thing. In our neighborhood, any major exterior project like that required explicit approval from the HOA. You had to submit plans, get signatures, and wait weeks before a single shovel touched the dirt. Everyone knew this. It was one of the strictest rules in the book. I remembered vividly when a family 3 streets over had been denied approval for a small shed because it interfered with neighborhood aesthetics. Yet here was my neighbor, the self-appointed rule enforcer, blatantly breaking one of the most ironclad HOA policies. The hypocrisy burned like fire in my chest. This was the same man who had tattled on me for a trash can, for a dog bark, for parking in my own driveway. And yet he thought he could get away with constructing an entire pool without following the rules. He weaponized against everyone else. I remember gripping my grocery bags tighter, the plastic biting into my hands as I stood in my kitchen and thought about it. This wasn't just unfair, it was infuriating. The final straw wasn't another letter, another fine, another smirk from across the yard. It was this. His arrogance. His belief that the rules applied to everyone but him. For the first time since this whole mess began, I stopped feeling like a victim. The knot of frustration and humiliation I'd been carrying turned into something sharper, steadier. I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore. I was going to fight back, and soon. The perfect way to do it would fall right into my hands. That evening, after the discovery of the pool construction, I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea, staring out at the fading light. My mind was racing. I kept replaying the sight of those workers hauling cement and the smug certainty I'd seen so many times in my neighbor's expression. He really believed he was untouchable. The injustice of it gnawed at me. Here I was, being dragged through the mud over the most trivial infractions, while he dug a gaping hole in his yard for an unapproved luxury project. It wasn't just hypocrisy, it was arrogance of the highest order. That's when my eyes drifted toward the corner of my garage, where my drone sat on its shelf, gathering dust. I had bought it a year earlier as a hobby, using it to capture pretty shots of my garden from above or to film my dog running through the yard. I hadn't touched it in months, and then it hit me. The drone could see what I couldn't. The tall privacy panels he'd erected were meant to keep prying eyes away. From the ground, no one could see the pool project unless they were standing in his yard. But from the air, the drone could capture everything. I felt a spark of excitement as the idea formed, sharp and undeniable. This wasn't about snooping into his private life, this was about documenting a violation that directly impacted the whole community. If he could weaponize the rules against me, then I could use those very rules to hold him accountable. The next morning, I charged up the batteries and took the drone outside. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the controls, the hum of the blades filling the quiet street. I launched it high enough to remain over my own property but angled the camera toward his yard. And there it was. Crystal clear footage of workers installing the framework of the pool, mixing cement, stacking tiles. The footage even captured pallets of supplies with company logos visible, leaving no doubt about what was happening. I circled the drone carefully, recording from multiple angles, timestamp visible on every shot. It felt almost cinematic, as though I were filming the climax of a movie. When I brought the drone back down, I scrolled through the clips on my screen. Each one was undeniable proof. The very same man who had harassed me with endless HOA reports was committing one of the most serious violations in the book. I couldn't help but smile, a rare, almost giddy feeling bubbling up inside me. For weeks, I'd felt cornered, powerless, boxed in by his petty games. Now, for the first time, the balance had shifted. I had something stronger than his complaints. I had the truth, and I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. With the drone footage safely saved on my computer, I felt a calm sense of resolve settle over me. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I wasn't reacting to his attacks, I was preparing my own. I knew better than to rush. The footage was powerful, but if I wanted it to truly land, I had to present it properly. So I spent the next few evenings putting together a neat, organized package. I clipped the video into segments, labeling each one by date and time. I made still frame screenshots showing the construction equipment, the workers, and the progression of the pool itself. I even typed out a short report, quoting directly from the HOA bylaws that required written approval for any major exterior renovation, that it wasn't just evidence, it was a case file. When I finished, I slid everything into a large manila envelope, sealed it, and addressed it to the HOA board. My hands shook slightly as I dropped it off at their office, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the thrill of knowing that the balance of power had finally shifted. Days passed, and I heard nothing. I carried on as usual, tending to my garden, walking my dog, and trying not to let my imagination run wild. But inside, I felt like I was carrying a quiet secret, a storm waiting to break. Then, one evening, I received an email from the HOA. They thanked me for submitting my concerns and assured me that the board would investigate. Immediately, they asked if I could attend the next HOA meeting to discuss the matter. Of course, I agreed. That night, I barely slept. I kept picturing his face when the truth came out. The smug certainty, the gloating glances. How would he react when the rules he had so proudly enforced became the very noose around his neck? The meeting day arrived. I sat in the small community center, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and listened as the board went through their usual agenda. Then, finally, my case came up. The president of the HOA cleared her throat and said, "We've received a submission regarding an unapproved construction project on Lot 17. All eyes turned to my neighbor. He shifted in his chair, but his expression was calm, almost bored, as if he were already planning to deny everything. Then they played the footage. On the screen at the front of the room, my drone video rolled shot after shot of his backyard, the pool taking shape in perfect clarity. The timestamp glowed in the corner. The workers moved in and out, hauling supplies, pouring cement, laying tile. The evidence was irrefutable. For the first time since I'd known him, his mask slipped. He leaned forward, his face paling, then reddening, then paling again. His jaw clenched tight, and he stammered something about privacy violations and misunderstandings. But the board cut him off. The footage was undeniable. He had broken one of the most fundamental HOA rules, and he hadn't even attempted to seek approval. Sitting there, watching it all unfold, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. My plan had worked. The man who had turned my life upside down with petty reports was now facing a reckoning of his own, one he could not escape. Asterisk. The room was silent for a moment after the footage ended, the hum of the projector the only sound. I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, but inside I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears. All eyes were on him now. The man who had spent months hiding behind the HOA's rules was finally stripped bare. At first, he tried to laugh it off. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice tight but forced into a mocking tone. "It's just a little backyard project. People add things all the time. Why are we wasting time on this?" The president of the HOA adjusted her glasses and tapped her pen against the table. "Mr. Carver," she said firmly, "this is not a little project. This is a major structural addition. An in-ground pool requires not only HOA approval, but city permits and safety inspections. We have no record of you ever submitting a request." He shifted in his chair, his composure starting to crack. His eyes darted around the room, as if searching for an ally, but the other neighbors sat stiffly, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright anger. Many of them had been victims of his nitpicking, too. Now, they were seeing him exposed. He tried another angle. "That video is an invasion of privacy. It's not even legal to." But before he could finish, another board member cut in. "The footage was taken from outside your property line. It clearly shows construction in progress. And even if it hadn't, your lack of paperwork speaks for itself. There's no record of approval because you never sought it." His face turned crimson. He sputtered, denying, deflecting, even raising his voice in frustration. But the more he fought, the more powerless he looked. For every excuse he threw out, the HOA had a counterpoint. The rules he had once wielded against others were now closing in on him like a cage. I sat there quietly, not gloating, not smirking, just calm. Watching justice unfold was enough. Finally, the president laid down the verdict. The pool had to be removed immediately, and he would be fined for every day the violation had gone unaddressed. On top of that, he was being placed on probation with the HOA, meaning any future infractions, no matter how small, would result in doubled penalties. For a man who thrived on playing the rule enforcer, it was a devastating blow. The meeting adjourned, and as chairs scraped back and people shuffled out, I caught his eye. His expression was a mix of rage and disbelief, as if he couldn't fathom how the situation had turned against him. For once, there was no smugness, no superiority, only the hollow look of a man who'd lost control. In that moment, I felt no need to say anything. He knew, and that was enough. It was about 3 weeks after the meeting when the sound of machinery once again filled the neighborhood. Only this time, it wasn't the hopeful clatter of construction. It was the harsh, grating roar of demolition. I remember standing at my upstairs window, looking out over the fence line, where once there had been workers carefully shaping the outline of a luxurious pool. Now there were men in hard hats, jackhammers tearing through concrete, backhoes scooping out rubble, and dump trucks hauling away the remains piece by piece. His grand project was being destroyed, and there he was, standing on his back patio, arms crossed tightly over his chest, jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. I could almost feel the fury radiating off him, the helplessness of being forced to watch his dream pool reduced to dust and debris. For weeks, he had strutted around as though he was above the rules, untouchable. Now, the same rules he had so viciously used against me had turned on him with brutal precision. The irony was almost poetic. As I watched, I couldn't help but remember all those little HOA letters I'd received. The trash can, the grass, the wreath, the barking dog. All the tiny, humiliating notices that had made me feel like I was constantly under a microscope. Compared to losing a pool worth tens of thousands of dollars, those infractions looked laughable. I stood there quietly, sipping my coffee, not needing to gloat or say a word. The sight itself was enough. Every smash of the jackhammer, every scoop of concrete being hauled away, felt like a piece of justice falling into place. By the end of the week, the backyard was nothing more than a scarred patch of dirt. No pool, no victory for him, just silence. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Freedom. Once the last truck rolled away and the dust settled, the neighborhood felt different, calmer somehow. The giant scar of dirt in his backyard was a reminder not just to him, but to everyone of what happens when arrogance collides with accountability. After the demolition, the HOA dropped every single complaint that had been filed against me. In fact, one board member even pulled me aside privately and admitted they had suspected my neighbor of targeting me unfairly for months. But until the pool evidence surfaced, they hadn't had the leverage to push back against him. Now, his credibility with the board was shattered. His days of terrorizing the street with endless reports were over. The other neighbors noticed the shift too. Where once people had been polite but cautious around him, now they barely acknowledged him at all. Conversations on the sidewalk became easier, lighter, no longer shadowed by the fear that a casual remark might end up in a complaint. In a community that had once felt tense, there was a sense of quiet relief. As for me, life slowly returned to what it had been before all of this, simple and peaceful. I tended to my garden without second-guessing every move. I left my trash bins out without obsessively watching the clock. I hung a new wreath on my door and didn't worry about taking it down on the exact day the season ended. And every time I saw him in passing, walking to his car, checking his mail, or brooding on his porch, there was no smugness left. He couldn't look me in the eye. He knew that I had beaten him, not through spite or cruelty, but through the very rules he had once used as his weapon. That irony never stopped making me smile. Looking back, I think that's what made the whole ordeal worth it. It wasn't just about stopping his harassment, it was about showing him, and everyone else, that justice doesn't always roar in with drama and spectacle. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with a camera, a set of rules, and the patience to let the truth do the work. The moral is simple. If you live by exploiting the rules, don't be surprised when those same rules rise up to hold you accountable. For me, the lesson was this: I didn't need to fight dirty or stoop to his level. All I needed was to stand firm, be smart, and trust that the truth, when revealed, would speak louder than his arrogance ever could. And it did. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.